I was so busy grinding academic prep for this episode that I didn't prepare any banter. I was just busy on JSTOR.
Honestly, that it was kind of some of the most fun I've had in prepping for an episode in a while.
Yeah, it was pretty great. I was telling you, I do miss sitting in my beautiful college library atrium with its lovely sculpture and little overpriced drinky drink. And, I was just working on it on my break at work, but it was fun. And it made me remember why I thrived so much in college because I'm really good at this kind of thing. But I am a little bit annoyed at my alma mater because despite paying it all of that money for my expensive degree, I can't use my college credentials to log into JSTOR. So I'm not sure how much money that would be depleting the college of if they allowed alums to access occasional academic papers. But one of the many libraries that I have a card to, which is not even technically for a place that I live, but because of rules, it was still totally legitimate for me to have a library card there, did have access to JSTOR. So the public library is always there for you. And I appreciated that.
As we've noted in the past, librarians aren't fucking snitches.
Mm
So, yeah, listen, we were having fun because it's not hard when you've got a library card.
hmm.
And that's a callback, kids.
Yeah. I also, and we'll get more into the actual meat of content in a moment, but I had gone so hard into researching primary sources that when I went back to the intro, um, and I guess we should get correct last name pronunciation.
We'll get there.
Okay. When I went back to the intro to the version of Beowulf that we'll be discussing, I realized that I had picked out from the primary sources some of the same quotes that she uses in the intro
Oh,
word
yeah.
for word because they're good quotes and we both have good research methods. But it was delightful. It was a little bit overwhelming, a little bit stressful, but also very fun.
I was really enjoying the academic research, trolling through Google Scholar for papers. I was a science nerd, so I know all the fun little tricks of getting like science papers, humanities papers, or something else entirely. But it was fun to sort of try and flex those muscles again. Although I did this morning, I was texting you about trying to find one of Tolkien's essays on the subject.
Mhm.
It was like, hey, I haven't been able to find this. And literally like 15 minutes later, you texted me and you're like, here it is with a full fucking PDF of the entire book in which the essay appears.
Why, thank you. I mean, to to your credit, the essay also was published under a different name and was part of the bigger book. And so I found out that it was part of the book, and then I thought, I bet I can find a PDF of this book. And then I found it. And I had to still make an account and, go jump through some hoops to get there. But once I found that the book existed, then we were good.
I have like light intro banter before we jump into the actual meat of what we're here to talk about.
Mhm.
It's been an extraordinarily stressful week. Watching American democracy dissolve around us in real time.
Mhm.
Um, or American quasi democracy, because it's not as if it's ever really served everyone in our country or been a true democracy ever. But it's one thing to have the facade of constitutional protections and powers, and another entirely to say, "Oh, yeah, you know, corporations can just do whatever the fuck they want, and also so can the president."
Mhm.
Um, I don't know, neither of us are political analysts or political scientists,
We're just bitches who are forced to live in this country and have to deal with the decisions that the people in charge of it make.
and are highly fucking opinionated about it.
Mhm. As we have every right to be.
But the rise of the far right in France and the crackdowns on immigration across the world, national borders are a joke, and, no nation state has the right to exist.
Mhm.
There, I said it.
No, I love it. I love it. This I don't know what the auditory equivalent of eagle-eyed, eagle-eared listeners may notice you talking significantly more than me in all of this. A, just because you're more educated about world politics in general, I feel like. And B, just because you can speak for both of us on these matters. I fully agree with everything that you're saying. These can all be considered official stances of this podcast.
We're a couple of, little leftist fucks, who bought microphones on the internet, decide to talk about fantasy.
If the right wing fucks can do it, so can we. And our thing is actually contributing to society. So I think our tens of listeners are happy that we're here. We're happy that they're here.
This is true. I am very happy that our listeners are here, putting up with our bullshit. Just I know a couple of episodes ago, I had a lot of, like, poetic, uh, diatribes on hope, right?
Hmm.
And on the necessity of hope. And just showing the other side here. If it's really hard to have hope sometimes when it feels like, the politicians that are supposed to protect you, are throwing you under the bus because it's politically expedient, or, you know, reading the news headline and seeing, another person like you get stabbed by a bunch of fucking kids. Um, or, you watch your friends get kicked out of another country, or it's really hard.
Hmm. It's not abstract, it's happening to us and our immediate circles of people that we know personally.
And even if it fucking wasn't, we can open our phones every goddamn day and watch children dying by the thousands.
Yeah.
Uh, and what do you do in the face of that?
Yeah, it's fucking hard.
You cling on to whatever little piece of hope you can. Send money places, you go to protests, you support your local community, all the way from delivering food to your neighbor when they're sick or they just had a baby or something, to all the way up to, depending on your skills and ability, providing, medical care or aid, or literally anything you can do, because, you know, what from as little to wearing a fucking mask when you get on public transit, all the way to, none of our listeners are doing this, donating millions of dollars to mutual aid.
Hmm.
Um, we protect each other. I don't
And
know. I don't have more profound thoughts,
no, that is
unfortunately, but
profound and I like it. And giving and receiving any of those small acts also helps us have hope. And if I am in a crowded place and I see another person wearing a mask, that gives me a little bit of hope. If I see someone taking care of someone else, that gives me a little bit of hope. If I'm able to receive that care, that gives me hope, because that just gives you that little bit of strength that you need to continue on a little longer. And that's not enough to change the tides of all of the horrible bullshit in the endless cycle of suffering and rebirth that we are all stuck in, depending on who you ask. But it's something. And that's all. It's all worthwhile. None of it's wasted.
rebellions are built on hope. If I may quote another piece of wonderful fantasy, that we will eventually touch on this podcast.
I was about to
Um,
say, because you were making a little face, and I was thinking, okay, is that a quote from something, or is that just you being smart? I can't tell. It is a quote from something. Okay.
uh, I have, but, speaking of, little pieces of fantasy, the other reason that we do things like this is for the purpose of escapism. And I know, I'm sorry to our listeners who perhaps come here for escapism and to escape the news cycle. And here we are rehashing it now, a couple months down the line. Um, but also, we're also here for escapism. And yet, also, unfortunately, sometimes there are things that we just can't turn away from. But I will say, though, the, you know, don't ignore the little joys in life, right? Not just because they give you hope, but because, you know, they keep you rested, they keep you whole so that you can get up and go out and fight. Um, Human souls and society and community are made mostly of story, if I may quote one of the authors that we are discussing today. Um, and story and fantasy and escapism are essential to the human condition. Um, and without that, it's hard to call us truly human.
I love that. I think that's a nice segue into what we are here to talk about, which still deals with very grand questions of humanity and morality, but is, a little bit more removed from our current political turmoils. What are we going to talk about today, Bestie?
Well, let's get into it. Did you want to talk about the other thing, or do we want to save that for next week?
We can save that for next week because it does kind of become relevant. That'll just be our
Fair.
little seed that we will plant, that we will grow.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Fandom Apprentice. I'm one of your hosts. I'm Ryn, and I'm joined today by my best friend, as always.
Hello, I'm Sam. I'm the other one.
And today we are not discussing Tolkien's books. We are taking a well deserved break, and we are discussing instead uh, the fourth rule of fantasy as established by the Phantom Apprentice. It all comes back to Beowulf.
I also love that our version of a well deserved break is assigning ourselves significantly more work than we usually do.
Uh huh.
Because
Exactly.
that's us. That's the kind of people we are. And I love it. I'm here for it.
My coworkers were like, "Oh, we have a long weekend this weekend. Are you relaxing, doing anything fun?" And I was like, "I mean, yeah, I do have at least one social event every single day. I'm an introvert, by the way, so this is
Mhm.
fun."
Yeah, we're the type of people who have a podcast. I think that's implied.
So, today we are talking about Beowulf. And we're going to talk quite a bit about Beowulf. We will not actually be talking about the content of Beowulf today. We'll get into that next time because there is such a large corpus of work leading into this piece of epic poetry that we wanted to sort of discuss some of the background and the translation we're reading itself before we got into the actual text itself. So I had a segue here. I guess to start off, I want to ask the question, what is Beowulf? Or should I say, what is Beowulf?
Stop. No, don't stop. You're perfect. That is a very interesting question. Did you have a prepared answer? Was that a rhetorical question? What is the question?
What is the question? For reference, what is the opening word of Beowulf? We've sort of semi mentioned this in some of our episodes before. It does not mean what. There are many ideas of how to translate that one singular word, and we'll talk about that in a bit.
Mhm.
Um, but I will keep making that joke because it's fucking funny.
As you should.
Um, Beowulf is a story, and I've already, in our intro, waxed poetic about the purpose of story. Um, but I want to read, a little piece. Um, we are all of us made of the stories we tell, the stories we learn, the stories our parents told each other, the stories they heard from their grandparents and their grandparents, and the wandering people who in the mix came to dinner once or spoke through the radio or the television, preachers, provocateurs, puppets. Human souls in society are made mostly of story. And that comes from a person we'll talk about a little bit later. I will credit her in a little bit. But Beowulf is, at its core, a story. It is also an incredibly important historical text. It is one of the older examples of uh, written English text that we have. It is written in Old English. In it's a particular type of dialect that I did not write down. It's some sort of Western Saxonic Saxon type dialect,
Mhm.
but it tells at its core a story. It is a piece of epic poetry that tells the story of a great warrior and king named Beowulf and his exploits, and his slaying of three different monsters, or four, depending on how you really want to read it.
Ooh, we'll get to that.
The text that we have uh, comes from the Noel Codex, which was written somewhere between 976 and 1025 AD. The Codex also contains a fragment of the life of St. Christopher, a prose text entitled Wonders of the East, a letter from Alexander the Great to Aristotle, which may or may not have been an actual letter from Alexander the Great to Aristotle, and another piece of Old English poetry entitled Judith, which is a
Mm.
poetic retelling of Judith's killing of Holofernes, which our resident religious scholar could tell us more about if she wanted, but
I studied Buddhism. I don't have anything about Judith besides that she's great and there's an amazing painting of her. If you have questions about Samsara, I'm your girl, but Judith, unfortunately, is a stranger to me.
Judith is a stranger to me. Sounds like a really great like song title name.
Ooh, yeah. If I was poetically inclined, could do something with that.
Listeners, hit us up with your best Judith is a stranger to me poems.
I am given to understand she experienced a great deal of suffering, so we could have some common ground there.
She was subject to samsara.
That's Samsara, baby, with jazz hands.
Anyway, whether or not Beowulf was passed by oral tradition prior to it being written down is a matter of scholarly debate. And whether or not it was written, uh, you know, at the time that it was written down, that the Noah Codex is from, whether or not it was written shortly before, long before, that's all a matter of scholarly debate. So, if I may postulate in my entirely uneducated, I spent some time on the internet reading shit but have no other education on this opinion,
You may.
it absolutely cannot have been authored by the writers of the Codex because there were two writers. The handwriting and dialectical choices and types of spelling errors that we see change halfway through Beowulf. The first uh, writer wrote The Life of St. Christopher, Wonders of the East, Letter of Alexander to Aristotle, and Beowulf.
Mhm.
And then the second writer writes the second half of Beowulf and Judith. And so between that and the fact that like this codex and a lot of codices at the time were probably written down by monks copying down previous works or oral traditions, and the decisions that each of the scribes are making suggest that they're copying from a previous work. right? And that seems to be the scholarly consensus too.
Mhm.
Um, Scholars in general seem to place the actual composition of the poem anywhere between the 600s to the 900s somewhere, whether or not that's the poem or whether that's the story in general. But based on the dialectical and story elements of the poem, it's somewhere in those 300, 400-year period, right? Why are we talking about Beowulf? We're talking about Beowulf because it was a major contributor to Tolkien's scholarly work and also to Tolkien's worldview, to Tolkien's writing itself. He was, as we've mentioned on this podcast before, Britain's foremost Beowulf scholar of his time. And he placed the origin of the poem somewhere in the 700s. He was sort of the opinion that it couldn't have been written any later than a century following the Christianization of England, because there were, like, too many concrete pagan details, to have been, like, multiple generations removed from the practice of paganism.
Mhm.
We kind of have no way of knowing whether the story of Beowulf as presented in the Noel Codex is the original story, or if it's a creative interpretation of a previous story or tradition. Um, Honestly, it's probably incomplete as is. There almost seems to be sections of the story missing. Whether or not, this was just, these monks writing down what they heard from one storyteller one night, or whether a previous monk that they were copying from was writing from one storyteller one night. I strongly believe it was a piece of oral tradition prior to being written down. I think, like many stories were, that is sort of the basal version of storytelling.
Mhm.
Much like Homer's poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were oral tradition long before he got to them. I I have a feeling Beowulf probably was too. There's also parts of Beowulf that bear a pretty strong resemblance to other stories and traditions from the era and from the region, right? From Hrolf Kraki's saga with the strong bear-like warrior character from Geatland, coming to a king's hall to root out a monster, to the treasure hoarding dragon that bears not a small resemblance to Fafnir in the saga of the Volsungs, the two trolls tradition, as identified by some Beowulf scholars, to from Gretti's saga, versions of the bear's son's tale, which is sort of just a name for an overall folk tradition that evokes similar themes, biblical allusions, similar poetic traditions to Virgil and the Aeneid. So when we say it all comes back to Beowulf for modern fantasy, that's true. But it's also true that the deeper roots of that role is that there's no true original stories,
Mhm.
right? As Tolkien said, one cannot divorce the experiences of the author from the writings they produce, right? We can always place applicability, what we see on these stories, which is why there's been so much, you know, Beowulf scholarship, so many translations, so many retellings over the years, so many pieces recycled. There's a Star Trek Voyager episode where they find
Yes, it is
themselves
a
in
very fun
Beowulf.
episode.
It's incredible. I can't actually remember the first time that I heard the story of Beowulf. It was definitely through a retelling rather than a translation, but it was definitely, like, way in my childhood.
In classic Phantom Apprentice fashion, I had not really been exposed to Beowulf before. I knew that it existed because my 10th grade English teacher, because as I think we've mentioned previously, I'm a gay person. I had a strong relationship with my high school English teacher, Sumi. He had told us about some professor who, in the grand tradition of Tolkien, did this big dramatic reading and recitation of Beowulf for his students in Old English, and my teacher was telling us about how exciting and cool and dramatic it was to experience that poem and that it's possible for old stories to come alive and stuff. But that was all I knew. I didn't really know what it was about until I became friends with you, and now I feel like I've absorbed a lot through osmosis, and it is we'll talk about it more when we talk about the text of the one that we're reading, but it's living up to the years of hype. I am thrilled. I am hooked, but this is also a new journey for me with the story, and I am so into it. I'm also not really a poem person, so the fact that this is an epic poem and that I'm so into it, it's earned a lot of points with me. I'm fully on board.
Oh, I mean, I think I took a while. We're tangent again, but it's a bonus episode, which means more tangents than usual.
Mhm.
Um, I also have never been a huge poetry person, much to your spouse's chagrin.
Very sad. My spouse is a poet. Their mom is a poet. She's a poetry professor. I married into a family of poets, and I'm simply not one of them.
Yeah, I have in my old age grown an appreciation for poetry that I did not have as a child. Um, but that, of course, means that as a mythology child, absorbed prose retellings of all of these myths, of the Iliad, of the Odyssey, of Beowulf. I think, I probably heard little pieces of retellings, like one piece at a time. I remember hearing the story of Grendel, and for many years, I feel like conflating the story of Grendel and the story of Grendel's mother for a
Mhm.
long time because they have a very similar structure. And being like, "Oh, that's just one monster. Beowulf just went down into the bog once to kill this monster." No, we'll talk about that next time. Um, but yeah, there have been prose translations of Beowulf, but there's also been plenty of retellings and adaptations and new stories based on it. Um, we had a cooperative game of Thousand-Year-Old Vampire going for a while, which is technically a solo journaling game. And we set it to start in 753 with the Viking raid on Lindisfarne. And the character that I was writing as um, ends up 30 years later essentially playing the part of Grendel in a Beowulf retelling that I ended up writing into this journaling game.
God damn, you did. And I didn't know at the time.
I
This is what
literally at the
happens when
end
your
of
bestie is very smart and cool and well read. They just do all these clever little things for their own entertainment, and then you don't realize until like 2 years later. Yeah, no, you totally. Because all I remember about that character is that she was really hot and got reunited with her girlfriend, and if you're a vampire, you don't need to breathe and you have a lot of stamina, and that's mostly what I remembered. But no, also clever literary things. God damn.
no, I put literary notes at the end of every one of those journal entries.
You did,
And
but that was a long time ago.
okay, anyway. Um,
I forgot.
so all that to say, you know, Beowulf is a part of the literary corpus, and the elements that make up Beowulf are as well. So when we say it all comes back to Beowulf, this is true, but also it all goes deeper than that. All of these old stories are intertwined. We can see little pieces in all of them. I was watching again the lecture that I pulled that quote from earlier today. Um, and the author giving the lecture was talking about a Japanese myth that closely resembles Orpheus and Eurydice. And she didn't say it resembled Orpheus and Eurydice. I was just listening to it and hearing about uh, this one deity's wife, and I'm not remembering all the details because I didn't write it down. But this one deity's wife who dies, and he goes after her into the underworld and tries to bring her back to the land of the living, and turns back to look at her in the torchlight and sees she's already rotting away. And I was like, oh, it's just Orpheus. And I have no idea whether or not that story has any relation to the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. They're separated by a whole lot of physical space and time as well. So, but that was just immediately what my mind jumped to, because humans tell the same stories. We have stories about the same themes, about the same things that we care about love and loss and fear and power and misunderstanding, um, and the unknown, right? And the fantasy stories that we tell attempt to explain some of that. And so the fact that Beowulf, which deals with a lot of that, which deals with how to protect those you care about, which deals with loss, which deals with aging, which deals with how to be a hero, with how to be a monster, which deals with, again, the unknown, the monstrous. It's no surprise that it has lasted this long and has made its way into our consciousness. It is no surprise to me that Tolkien, with his love for what he considered to be quintessentially English, was so enamored with this tale. It is no surprise to me that there is this corpus of Beowulfiana, which is the lovely term for the corpus of scholarly work that has come out of Beowulf.
Mhm.
But anyway, do we want to talk a little bit about Tolkien and Beowulf?
I would love to, because this is something that I came prepared to talk about. I came a little over prepared. The scholarly research was exciting, but then it also got away from me a little bit. And then I found myself very overwhelmed with 15 tabs open of all different articles. And then I had to rein myself in a little bit. So, in a brief and hopefully concise and intelligible fashion, as we have thoroughly established, Tolkien was very into Beowulf, and he had his translation that he was working on. And according to the Tolkien estate, it was complete in 1926 when he was 34, and but only complete in the sense that it went from the beginning of the story to the end of the story, but it was not finished during his lifetime. He kept going back and adding to it and changing it and fussing with it, and it never reached a state that he felt was ready to be published. But it is there. It did all get done in some form, just not in a perfectly polished form. But
Well,
there were,
and that's
yes.
because as he says in his essay on translating Beowulf, it's basically impossible to translate Beowulf perfectly.
I wish that I had read Babel by R.F. Kuang because I want to
Uh-huh.
appreciate the context of, I don't remember if it was just something they said or if it was a line from the book about every translation being an act of betrayal. Translation is really hard. And both in the sense that you just lose a lot of subtlety and meaning and context when you have to substitute words for other words, but also that when you are making those choices, you are imposing a viewpoint, you're imposing an agenda on the story. And he had to choose what his agenda was going to be. And his goal with the translation that he produced was basically just to be a companion for students studying the original. So, students who were reading the Old English, who are trying to interpret it, to have another perspective, to have a benchmark in language that was a little more familiar to them. And so he was not necessarily trying to preserve the poetic structure of it all, but his goal was to create something that would be useful to support scholarly research.
Right, and it his the first line of that essay on translating Beowulf is, "No defense is usually offered for translating Beowulf," which I just think is perfect. That establishes where we're starting from.
Yeah. No defense is usually offered, but I'm going to give you one, and it will be in detail. I also just finished reading Math and Drag by Kind Santos. And she's a drag queen who does a lot of math videos on TikTok. If you've seen a drag queen talking about math, this is probably the same person. And I found myself thinking about so many similarities between math and mythology as I was going through all of this, because in the book she talks a lot about using math to uncover fundamental truths about the universe and what is the human condition and what is objective reality and what statements do we have to justify, what do we need to accept as self-evident in order to have systems that make sense. So just thinking about axioms and justifications and things, Tolkien is establishing his axioms. He is giving us the baseline by which we can then evaluate the rest of his work.
Yes.
So, thinking back to the topic of word choice, he really wanted to preserve the narrative. And one of the things that he talks about in the essay on translating Beowulf is that the words themselves can kind of become a distraction because they feel so archaic and strange if every single one is just translated literally. So he's trying to get across the gist of the story and the artistry of it without necessarily doing a perfect, whatever a perfect linguistic translation might be. But he also had a quote about this problem of trying to modernize it without making it too modern. A warning against colloquialism and false modernity has already been given earlier in the same essay. Personally, you may not like an archaic vocabulary and word order artificially maintained as an elevated and literary language. You may prefer the brand new, the lively, and the snappy. But the author of Beowulf did not share this preference. If you wish to translate, not rewrite Beowulf, your language must be literary and traditional, not because it is now a long while since the poem was made, or because it speaks of things that have since become ancient, but because the diction of Beowulf was poetical, archaic, artificial, if you will, in the day that the poem was made. And we will be reveling in, we will be embracing colloquialism and false modernity with the translation
Uh-huh.
that we are reading. And I I'm not mad about it. I'm not mad at Tolkien for having this perspective. I love it. I love that we are about to embark on this project of being so aggressively modern and colloquial because we are finding ourselves in this story and we are making space for ourselves in this story. And that's the whole point of it. And it's
Right.
wonderful.
Well, and I think that gets to Tolkien's other point about translating Beowulf, which is the why he was doing it, right? He wanted it to be understandable to his students.
Mhm.
He was saying, it's so difficult to translate kennings and idioms, words that have no direct translation into modern English from our precursor language, right? The language before the intervening millennium of French conquest, followed by global imperialism, which, with its all consuming nature, ends up gobbling up loan words and new phonemes and etymologies by the thousands, right?
Mhm.
And fundamentally changing the language and our context of it.
And the context is so important because there are so many words in Old English for concepts that were important to those people. So there's a ton of different words for the sea and ships and swords and men, which were all essential to the culture that produced Beowulf. But when we are translating them, they all just kind of get lumped into similar categories. Tolkien points out in the On Translating Beowulf essay that there are 10 virtual synonyms for the word man in the original text of Beowulf, and up to 25 that don't specifically translate to man, but could be lad or young man or warrior or boy, that also kind of all fall into the same category. But each of those unique words has a unique sound and meaning and cultural significance. And if we're dealing with kennings, which I think we've talked about on the show
Mhm.
before,
We have,
you
yeah.
can you can make those intelligible in a literal sense. You can translate them into words that a modern English reader can read, but without context, they're completely meaningless. And we don't
Mhm.
use as many compound words in modern English as we did in Old English. And then there's issues of meter and alliteration, and he goes into tremendous detail about both of those things which are fascinating, but I don't understand poetry enough to explain them. Just know that that
No,
makes it extra hard. It's an extra layer of things to consider. And there was all of these things about the Old English being composed in distinct complementary opposite word groups with different stressed syllable patterns. And there's a lot of just very nitty-gritty poetry details as well. This is a phenomenally huge undertaking, and I can see why it took him, his entire lifetime to even create a partial translation that he wasn't totally happy with, 'cause it seems fucking hard.
yes, and ultimately ultimately, it all comes back to that desire to understand the story and the majesty of the story and the poem,
And
right?
that yeah, mhm.
That is why we are reading the translation we are reading. That is why we chose that, and that is, why Tolkien was translating it, right? That is why the translator that we are reading made the choices that she did.
Yeah, because during Tolkien's time, an equally big undertaking to the all of the literary translation stuff was the prevailing view of Beowulf as a historical document, an interesting thing that we could learn some facts from, but it wasn't appreciated as a story. It wasn't considered art. I had
Right.
a couple of choice quotes from I forget if this was from the monsters essay or from the same one because I did not cite my sources within my own notes, shame on me.
It's
But
it's the Monsters and Critics essay because he specifically talks about too in that essay, um, like Beowulf being sort of only looked at as a poem,
mhm,
and for its poetic elements and its linguistic elements, and almost in contrast to his on translating Beowulf essay, where he goes basically, yeah, fuck all of that. Let's talk about the story of it.
yeah, and the views at the time were not kind. He had some real zingers about how people viewed Beowulf, such as a half-baked native epic, the development of which was killed by Latin learning. It is feeble and incompetent as a narrative. It is the confused product of a committee of muddle-headed and probably beer-bemused Anglo-Saxons, and so on. It was it was ice
Fucking
cold. It was
cheers, motherfucker, as I raise my beer.
that was a rough environment to go, "Hey guys, please respect this." And Tolkien illustrates the problem of trying to only mine Beowulf for historical facts while ignoring its artistic beauty with an allegory. And we know how he feels about allegories, and there are multiple allegories in this essay. And this one that I'm about to talk about, he says, and there's another allegory. Oh, it was so good. I felt this little bit of petty glee going, "Oh, professor, what an allegory here." But this is how passionately he felt about it, that he thought an allegory was the only way to get his point across. So desperate times call for desperate measures, but it did delight me. So this is what he says. I would express the industry being this picking apart of Beowulf for historical information, in yet another allegory. A man inherited a field in which was an accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stone, some had already been used in building the house in which he actually lived, not far from the old house of his fathers. Of the rest, he took some and built a tower. But his friends, coming, perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over with no little labor in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or to discover whence the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material. Some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it and forgot even the stones. They all said, "This tower is most interesting," but they also said, after pushing it over, "What a muddle it is in!" And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, "He is such an odd fellow. Imagine his using these old stones just to build a nonsensical tower. Why did not he restore the old house? Has he?" He has no sense of proportion. But from the top of that tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea. And that is just such a beautiful way of putting it, of, this tower built of old stones from which you could look out on the sea and experience the beauty of the world, just being knocked down and totally disregarded, and you're just completely missing the point of the original structure. That's what we had been doing to Beowulf as an English speaking society. And it
That's
was
some pet
beautiful.
Tower of Babel shit.
It got me. It was so good.
There you go. So, Sam, do we wanna talk about the translation that we're reading?
Yes, I just had one more little tiny thing about Tolkien
Please,
before we get into
by
modern
all
stuff.
means.
So, another thing that was important to him in terms of conveying the full experience of trying to get us to stand on that tower and look out over the sea with him. He also had a lot of concern for what the experience of hearing the story would be like, the literal sounds of the words, about balancing volume and pitch and the way that it would have potentially originally been told. And your interpretation of the story when hearing it is based on the significance of the content and not the inflection of the narrator. And he also talks about using this translation as a literal instrument to make the story audible. And there were just so many good allegories, good metaphors, good comparisons for how passionately he felt about Beowulf and how he was trying to get other people to also experience it. And ultimately, that was successful. And that has brought us here, and that has brought us to the translation that we are both absolutely dying to talk about. If you want to
Yes.
take it
It
away,
just
Bessie.
as you talked about the experience of telling the story, I think I've mentioned on the podcast before, but my experience of being at the town of Lejre in Denmark, which is the modern site of Leidegard, which was the hall of King Hrolf and potentially one of the actual locations that Heorot, Hrothgar's hall in Beowulf, was based on. And we stood within the outline, my whole Nordic mythology class, of a 6th century mead hall, and our professor read from Beowulf. And that experience uh, of hearing the story in its oral tradition in, you know, what was simply a ring of stones in an empty field now in our modern era. But I could imagine a scenario in which we're surrounded by timbers and fire pits and uh, the spear danes and the war wedded and ring bearers and cup bearers and people shouting and carousing by candlelight, to use a phrase from this translation. Um, and I think that experience of experiencing Beowulf in the oral tradition, um, in this location where you could think about what it must have been like to hear that in situ. I don't, I don't know. It was something else. That's the experience of the story that I think Tolkien perhaps was trying to achieve. And that is the experience I think that Maria Devana Headley is also managing to achieve in many ways. And that is the translation we are reading. Maria Devana Headley's 2020 new translation of Beowulf. Um, I adore this translation. I think it manages to preserve a certain amount of poetry while also, as Sam said, reveling in colloquialism and false modernity.
It's so
Um,
good.
there are certain elements of it that maintain Tolkien's archaic vocabulary and word order, and certain elements that absolutely fucking do not.
This book had me from the cover. The cover art is beautiful. There's this stylized neon orange medieval script looking bee with a crown over it, but it's also interwoven with this woodcut monster thing. And I would say this is reading too much into it, but I don't think it is. That the monster's face is obscured because I know we're dealing with themes about what it means to be a monster, and it's gorgeous, it's beautiful, and then you open it into the author photo, the most badass author photo I've ever seen in my life. Maria Devana Headley has this cool undercut with a dragon shaved into it. She is queer, by the way. She is out. That is amazing. So I already trust anything she has to say based on the cool cover art and the cool author photo and, years of rigorous scholarship. But I was on board immediately.
I have also read, oh my god, I'm just seeing here at the on the back,
Mhm.
uh, author photograph by Beowulf Sheehan.
Stop.
She found someone named fucking Beowulf to take her author photograph
That's so cool.
for her Beowulf translation. And she has a, Beowulf retelling that I also read, this year, entitled "The Mere Wife," um, which is a double play on the Old English word applied to Grendel's mother, Mirwif, um, with the Old English "wif" for woman, and "mir" being the word for the swamp, and also on the modern English usage of the word mere as meaning simply,
Mhm.
um, you know, simply a wife, just a wife. That book was phenomenal. Um, you know, positioning Grendel's mother as a uh, veteran of the U.S. military, coming back from the Middle East, where she's had a hand in some number of atrocities, um, and had some number of atrocities committed against her, um, by her own people, and coming back to the U.S. with PTSD and no support, as too often is applied to veterans. We could get into a whole other side discussion about how the US and American culture treats, um, veterans, and how, it positions them essentially as a priest class while they're
Ooh.
actively in service with the military. And, we're essentially expected to worship them. And then as soon as they get home from that, um, how they're sent away and primed to die for the American imperialist project, for American hegemony, and primed to commit atrocities and maintain American terror abroad. And then as soon as they come home with the effects of that, they're immediately tossed aside by that same American hegemony and that same American imperialist project, having served their purpose.
That is so spicy. And I already have The Mere Wife checked out. And as soon as I finish Beowulf, because I'm only halfway through it right now, I will be reading it right away.
That was exactly what I did. I read Beowulf and then I immediately went to The Mere Wife. It was honestly the best way to do that, because you're then primed to think about these themes, that she's putting in. But anyway, um, MDH, as she identifies herself within, her introduction, is a is an author, a scholar. Um, she gave the 2023 Tolkien lecture on fantasy at Oxford, um, which was she was originally invited to give back in 2018 by one of the founders of the lecture, who is now, I believe, her husband.
God, that's so
Um,
cute.
and they have a son together. Um, as she says in the beginning of the lecture, they ended up talking and staying in touch and talking about the lecture, and one thing led to another, and they fell in love. And in 2019, instead of delivering the lecture, she delivered their son.
Oh, I love that. That's beautiful.
It's very, very cute.
Yeah, and the intro to this book is the most I have ever cared about an intro to a book. It is so passionate and so gripping, and it is what made us realize that we had to split Beowulf into 2 episodes because we couldn't just do this on top of the plot. Because she
No.
really very firmly establishes what her project is with this book and the questions that she wants us to consider. And yeah, she just immediately is able to at least get me on board to see how much possibility there is in this story. This project that she shared with Tolkien of trying to get people to see the human experience in Beowulf.
And
It got
she
me.
did yeah, she did say in her lecture, that she was haunted by fears the professor showing up with a briefcase full of a 1,000-page critique of her language choices.
She also
Um,
references the exact Tolkien quote that I read earlier about translating and not rewriting, which made me happy because it means we both have good, rigorous research methods. But yeah, I love that it was not even planned, but then just reading this introduction, realizing that we are engaged together in the same project.
yeah, I do want to read, her response to that quote,
Yes,
which is,
please do.
"Tolkien and I wouldn't have agreed when it comes to the sort of language required for a translation of Beowulf. Perceptions of literary and traditional language vary widely depending on who's doing the perceiving, and Tolkien had a liking for the courtly that I do not share. But we agree that the original's dense wordplay must be reckoned with." Um, which is fucking wild.
Yeah. And
I love these 2 different perspectives that we get, um, Tolkien, and from our experiences with Tolkien, and now from, you know, someone who matches some of our modern sensibilities.
quite a lot of our modern sensibilities, I would say. Um and although this is a poetic translation, she was also motivated by the story and led by the narrative, but structured it to speak in a more contemporary rhythm. And I love the way that she describes the vibe that she's going for of hearing the story being shouted to a drunken crowd for a quote communal colloquial history unquote, and going to such great lengths to shine a light on the women in the story and their agency and their power. And I think related to our queer reading of Tolkien in trying to find space for ourselves in the story of Lord of the Rings and making that space forcefully, and how my tremendous privilege is having queerness and Tolkien be intertwined from the start, having that same sensibility applied to Beowulf. This is my introduction. I never got the dusty ass, boring version of Beowulf. I got the cool, awesome feminist one that was made for me. It was made for us by one of our people in our community. And it feels so good. It feels amazing to be welcomed into something that's so approachable and feeling like the space has already been made for me. And now I get to participate in all of the big, cool philosophical questions and ancient poetry and shit, but I get to start here. And this is such an awesome thing to get to have. And I'm really, really excited about it. And we haven't even started talking about the plot, but I'm just so fully on board. And I like to imagine that MDH would be very happy to hear our reactions.
Mhm. Mhm. We are 2 fantasy nerds who enjoy reading this sort of thing. Um, and it's always nice to feel like, um, there is a space for us. Um, she has a line in here, again, directly after her discussion on, her choices differing from Tolkien's. Amid a slew of regressions in the past half decade, I must cite a win: the democratization of information. Access to formerly gate-kept texts has been radically broadened. Um, Not only is the original accessible to anyone with an internet connection, so are a huge number of translations and volumes of evolving scholarship, many long out of print. This translation exists because of that access. It is both pleasurable and desirable to read more than one translation of this poem because when it comes to translating Beowulf, there is no sacred clarity. Every translator translates this poem differently. That's part of its glory. Yeah, I think that's what needs to be said there.
And I'll even bookend that with her closing thoughts from the introduction about how, she has tried to, and I think successfully, made space for all of our voices and other voices, but that there are also stories and perspectives within Beowulf that haven't been addressed yet, that still need to be reckoned with. And that is part of this project that we can all participate in. And her closing thought from the introduction, um, about what we can, possibly gain from this. We might, if we analyzed our own long-standing stories, use them to translate ourselves into a society in which hero making doesn't require monster killing, border closing, and horde clinging, but instead requires a more challenging task: taking responsibility for one another. I fucking love it.
Way to connect back to our intro there, bestie. And
It's so
also, Maria, thank you.
Yeah, that was really convenient of you to write this, 4 years ago to perfectly segue into our podcast introduction. But yeah, no, fuck borders and hordes and capitalism and alienating our fellow human beings. It's so good. That's our philosophy. Our values are aligned.
I
And
I
how
would I
exciting
would
is
say
that?
that's an incredible place to close it, but I do have 2 more points I wanna touch on before we get into the meat of Beowulf.
Absolutely.
The first point is that of Beowulf as a character,
Mhm.
and Beowulf as a hero. Is Beowulf a hero or not? Um, we are going into this sort of with the understanding from our day-to-day lives and from our previous readings of fantasy that Beowulf is the classic hero. Beowulf is the warrior type. Um, Beowulf is a hero because he comes across the sea ready, able, and willing to do violence. And ready and able and willing to do violence all on his own. Such extreme violence that he is, you know, a cut above everyone else. Um, and I want to read a quote from Tolkien here,
Please
which
do.
is Beowulf is not then the hero of a heroic lay, precisely. He has no enmeshed loyalties nor hapless love. He is a man, and that for him is meant and many is sufficient tragedy. It is not an irritating accident that the tone of the poem is so high and its theme so low. And then to follow that up with a quote from MDH's introduction: is this text attempting to be a manual for successful masculinity? No, although at a glance it appears to be a hero story. Beowulf is a manual for how to live as a man if you are, in fact, more like the monsters than the men. It's about taming wild, solitary appetites and about the failure to tame them. It is not, in the poet's opinion, entirely to Beowulf's credit that he continues wild and solitary into old age. So, is Beowulf the hero because he slays monsters? Does he make himself the hero through his ultimate demise at the end? By removing himself, is he removing a fourth monster? Or by perishing in his battle, does that end up removing a fourth monster from the story? Who is truly a monster? Is it the one wielding violence against our heroes, or is it the one wielding violence in service of our heroes? Is Grendel's mother a monster because she seeks revenge for the death of her son? Is Hrothgar a monster because he seeks revenge for the death of his warriors? Is the dragon a monster because she seeks revenge for the theft of her cup? And is Beowulf a monster because he simply seeks glory?
And that's just a fraction of the questions that this story raises. And there's a reason that we've been talking about it for thousands of years and hopefully will continue to. And I mean, this MDH translation is really accessible and it's short, listeners. If you, in the 2 weeks between now and our next episode, when we talk about the plot, if you want to read it, there's an audiobook. You can get it from your library. You don't have
There's an
to. We are
audiobook
happy to.
that's less than 4 hours.
Yeah, it's short. I mean, we are happy to discuss this, um, on your behalf, but I want other people to get as hype as we are about this story because it's just so exciting to participate in it. And something that I was thinking about in our conversation earlier was we've talked on the podcast before about sort of lamenting the loss of religion in our lives and the role that ritual played, both growing up as pretty religious people. I think also having these big stories and these big questions to connect back to, for me, is also filling a little bit of that void. And, having a challenging text to reckon with questions about what it means to live a good life and be a good king. That's awesome to, engage with another kind of mythology in a different way. It's scratching a little bit of that itch for me.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with that. I hadn't thought about that until now about, my love for mythology is perhaps filling some of that void. But yeah, whoa, I'm gonna talk about that in therapy now.
I have access
Uh,
to your calendar. I'll remind you before your appointment.
so the last point I thought, now that I think about it, I don't know that I want to get too in depth in, but I do want to then just touch very briefly, and we can talk about it more next time, about this one very particular translation choice that she makes right out the gate.
Oh,
'Cause
yes.
as we said, the word hwæt is the opening line of Beowulf. Um, and in the Old English, you have hwæt vi gardena in gerdagan theod sininga thrim gefrunon huta etlingas elin fremedon, which I'm sure my accent and pronunciation are atrocious. However, that's what you're hearing as the story opens. That is how Tolkien would open his classes, by striding to the front of the room, proclaiming these lines to his, undergrads studying Anglo-Saxon. Um, and there's so many ways to translate what. Is it lo? Is it listen? Seamus Heaney, who's one of the other sort of major recent translators, um, translates it as "so," and that he in the introduction to his translation, he says comes from his Irish grandfather telling stories, how he'd start any story that he told. That brings to mind for me, um, the Italian word "allora," which also means "so." It's just sort of an interjection that you put at the start of something you're about to say, you know,
That's how
"allora,"
you
and then,
that's how you know
you
a
know
friend is about to give you some really good gossip if it starts with "so."
but that
"So" is provocative.
right, but it's also something that, uh, the cashier at the local tabaki, and you're like, "I need these 3 things." They'll get the 3 things and go, "Allora," and, tell you your totals,
Mhm.
and that's how you go about your day, right? You know, so it's meant to be an attention-grabbing word, hwæt, and so I think, Sam, unless you have any other commentary, I wanna close just on this.
Please go right ahead, I would love nothing more.
Um, so instead, that first line, "Chwat we gardena in hirdagum," et cetera, Maria Devana Heatley then translates it, um, instead as, "Bro, tell me we still know how to speak of kings." Anyway, we'll see y'all in 2 weeks, to talk about the text of Beowulf. I'm so excited.
See you next time, y'all. You know where to find us. See you in 2 weeks.
The Phantom Apprentice is produced and edited by Ryn and Sam. Our music was composed and performed by James, and our art is by Casey Turgeon.